Okay, let's jump right in and set the scene. The year is 1778. We're way down in Chihuahua, Mexico, and there's this highly experienced map maker named Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco. He's hunched over, carefully drawing a line on a piece of vellum. He's drafting a map of the American West based on this absolutely grueling expedition he just barely survived. He's plotting out the rivers he measured, the canyons he crossed, and this massive inland body of water he documented, which we know today as Utah Lake. But then, right as he reaches the totally blank, unmeasured northwest corner of his map, he does something, well, something kind of wild. Based entirely on how he assumes water must flow in high country, he just goes ahead and draws a massive river flowing out of the lake all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He even names it, the Rio de San Buenaventura. The only problem? This massive, navigatable river to the sea absolutely does not exist. It's quite literally an illusion in ink. So today, in this explainer, we're going to unravel this fascinating story from the source material, the lake that was not there, and really dig into this intense historical friction between colonial ambition, map-making, and actual physical reality.
So, you're probably asking yourself, why on earth would a guy who spent 30 years taking precise measurements deliberately invent a river out of thin air? Well, it's because Miera totally understood that his map wasn't just some geographical record. It was a political argument. The Spanish crown desperately wanted a route to the Pacific. If Miera's map just showed a landlocked lake, well, that's a dead end. And this is actually a really crucial point when you compare the Spanish colonial worldview to what happened later in the United States. Unlike the later Lewis and Clark expedition, which was all about pragmatic, commercial realities for a young U.S., Miera was answering to this heavy, top-down bureaucracy of the Spanish crown. He essentially had to prioritize a complete map over an accurate one, because an empty space on that parchment basically signaled a total failure of Spanish imperial ambition.
And honestly, this just brilliantly illustrates the clash between two completely different ways of understanding the world. On one side, you have the Spanish colonial worldview. Miera implicitly trusts his instruments. He's measuring the flow of water in varas, calculating latitude with a quadrant, making these huge, sweeping geographical inferences. But then, on the other side, you have the indigenous guides who are actually leading the expedition. Guys like Sylvester or this young boy from the Laguna people, they aren't out there checking compasses. They have this deeply embodied pre-linguistic understanding of the terrain. I mean, they can literally smell standing water from miles away. They know the exact line to take across a valley simply because they've lived it. It's the difference between Miera trying to map the land from above and the indigenous guides knowing the land from the inside out.
Now, think about what happens when you impose that top-down reality onto a landscape that already has a rich, deep history. As the Spanish moved through the land, they were just constantly overriding existing identities. Like in August 1776, they hit a river, and Father Dominguez immediately names it the Dolores, permanently tying it to the Catholic feast calendar. But they didn't just stop at geography. When a Ute man agrees to guide them, the friars just immediately baptize him Sylvester. When a local Laguna boy joins them to help them get down to Utah Lake, they name him Joaquin. They didn't even bother asking for their original names. They just unilaterally assigned new ones.
Which leads to this incredibly profound and frankly, kind of chilling realization. Miera, who is meticulously recording every little detail in his field book, realizes that the book doesn't capture objective reality at all. It only captures what the colonial expedition chooses to feed it. The original indigenous names of these guides, the ancient lived-in names of the rivers, they just aren't recorded. Miera realizes that the names these guides arrived with will only survive as long as human memory holds on to them. But the imposed Spanish names in his book, those are going to travel south, get filed away in official archives, and endure forever. History, in this very literal sense, is curated entirely by the mapmakers.
And this brings us right back to that concept of inference. When Miera was standing there on the muddy shores of Utah Lake, he's looking at a body of water that is way smaller than his geographic theories required. But instead of just accepting what he physically saw, he trusted his internal logic of a landscape over the actual reality right in front of his face. He basically reasoned that, well, the massive watershed they just crossed must drain into a massive lake, which absolutely must drain into the ocean. That heavy colonial expectation essentially forced him to mathematically justify inventing the San Buenaventura River. The map became a projection of their desires, not a reflection of the earth. And again, it's just this perfect microcosm of how that top-down theoretical Spanish colonial planning constantly clashed with the rugged realities of the Americas, which is a stark contrast to the grounded, boots-on-the-ground pragmatism that you see later with U.S. expeditions.
All right, moving on to Section 1, the climax at Utah Lake, a negotiation of misunderstanding. Okay, so get this. When they actually meet the Timpanogos people at the lake, you have two completely different conversations happening at the exact same time.
On one side, Father Escalante is speaking incredibly passionately in Spanish about the one true God, offering eternal salvation, promising missions, and saying priests will return within a year. But the Timpanogos are hearing all of this through the filter of their own geopolitical reality. To them, a Spanish return means one thing: a military alliance. They accept the promise because they see it as an offer of Spanish protection against Shoshone raiders who are pushing in from the north. So you have both sides incredibly enthusiastic about this deal, entirely because they think they are agreeing to completely different things.
And the crazy part? The entire fate of this agreement rests on this tiny micro-narrative, a single choice made by the interpreter, a guy named Muñez. He speaks both languages. He clearly hears that the Timpanogos are talking about military defense against the Shoshone, while his Spanish bosses are talking about baptism. The source material highlights this single, pregnant second where Muñez just pauses, and in that second he makes a choice. He chooses not to correct the friars. He chooses not to explain the mismatch. He just turns and tells the priests, yep, the Timpanogos accept your mission. By just omitting that huge translation gap, Muñez cements this massive historical misunderstanding, just to ensure the expedition gets the political victory they need on paper.
But here's the thing. Paper victories don't exactly keep you alive in the wilderness. Leaving the lake, the expedition heads south, hoping they can loop west toward the California coast. But suddenly the terrain just stops cooperating with Miera's inferred map. The land becomes flat, arid, featureless. The water turns brackish. The horses start failing. Even their brand new indigenous guide, Jose Maria, realizes the Spanish are marching stubbornly into this impassable, hostile desert based on a completely flawed mental map. So what does he do? He silently abandons them in the middle of the night. The map has completely, utterly failed them.
And that failure leads them straight into a literal wall. The expedition hits a massive, snow-blocked Sierra. They are completely trapped. They're freezing. They're starving. They're totally out of options. And the leadership finally has to admit they cannot reach the Pacific. So what do? They turn to divine intervention. Father Dominguez writes Monterey on one slip of paper and Cosnina, which means the return route to Santa Fe, on another. They say a prayer and they draw a lot. They are literally leaving their grand imperial expansion up to pulling a name out of a hat. The lot says Cosnina, and just like that, poof, the grand colonial dream of reaching the sea evaporates. Miera's argument in ink is totally defeated by the harsh, icy reality of the winter terrain.
And honestly, the irony here is just amazing. The very night after they abandon the Pacific route, Miera takes out his quadrant. He looks up at the North Star, does the math, and determines his exact latitude, 37 degrees, 33 minutes. He knows precisely, down to the actual minute, exactly where he is situated on the global grid. And yet, he has absolutely no idea how to find a passable trail where the nearest fresh water is, or how to keep his expedition from starving to death. His European instruments give him total mathematical certainty, but zero practical survival knowledge in that specific landscape. It's wild, right?
Let's fast forward a bit, 24 years later to the year 1800. We're back at Utah Lake. There's a Timpanogos grandmother weaving a basket, and her grandchildren are asking her about those men in the dark robes who visited when she was young. They ask, why did the priests never come back? And her answer is just deeply profound. She explains that the men meant what they said, but that the men far away in Mexico City only heard, there is a lake. They never heard, we made a promise to the people. As she puts it, that is what happens when a promise travels too far through too many hands. Something falls out. It's like a tragic game of historical telephone.
She finishes her story with this incredibly powerful sentiment. They may come, they may not, but the lake is still here. We are still here. And she hit the nail on the head. The colonial expedition came, they imposed their names, they drew their flawed maps, they made their totally mistranslated promises, but ultimately all those grand imperial ambitions just faded back into the desert. What actually endured wasn't the ink on Miera's vellum map. What endured was the physical reality of the lake itself, and the indigenous people who knew exactly how to live alongside it without ever needing to measure it.
So as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a final thought to really chew on. Maker's map of 1778 literally shaped how the outside world viewed the American West for decades, filled with phantom rivers and erased identities. It's this stark reminder of how the Spanish colonial reliance on top-down, theoretical maps differed so wildly from the later, on-the-ground pragmatism of the U.S. westward expansion. And those differing approaches shaped two entirely different histories of the Americas. So it begs the question, when you look at the maps, the histories, and the records that structure your own world today, whose original names, whose voices, and whose stories are hiding in the blank spaces? Keep questioning the map. Thanks so much for joining me.